We come now to the sort of final acts or events of Reconstruction. One of the terms that's often been used for the end of Reconstruction is redemption. And as a term, redemption, which implies redeeming, means to restore. But in a sense, this use of the term redemption suggests a sort of positive event, and it comes from that larger Southern-dominated mythology about what Reconstruction was. If Reconstruction was corrupt, if those involved in Reconstruction were corrupt, then ultimately redemption, or the restoration of former Confederates to their positions of authority, restoration of state governments across the South to their authority to run the state, if that's what redemption meant, then for many Southerners, freedmen, Republicans, redemption probably wasn't the right label. Rather, it might be more fair to say that Reconstruction had diminished in importance for many Americans to the point that it had ground to a sort of end. And yet, even as I say that, I'm standing here thinking to myself, you can't really say that either. Because Reconstruction historians, especially in the last few decades, have recognized that the repercussions of Reconstruction, like most major historical events, the repercussions, the sort of waves that spread out from where the pebble drops in a calm pond and you get the ripple effect, those repercussions would continue to influence the United States for decades and decades. And I've even made several allusions to parallels between Reconstruction in the 1860s and what happens with the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. I think part of the reason that Reconstruction resonates has to do with how central the issues of Reconstruction were to what it means to be an American, what it means to have civil rights, to have voting rights, what the Constitution means, and also I think how truly integral issues of race have been to the history of this nation and to the ongoing debate about what it means to be an American. Well, in 1876, the United States faced yet another presidential election. Ulysses Grant, of course, was not going to run in 76. So the Republicans nominate a figure by the name of Rutherford Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, we often say, a Republican from Ohio. Hayes, a veteran with a fine war record, will run against Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York. And what really makes this election, I think, important and worth talking about briefly is that part of it is the repercussions of Grant's scandal and the very choice of Hayes, someone who never really stood out among Republicans, but he did have that war record, and I think more importantly, there really hadn't been any touch of scandal about Rutherford B. Hayes. His White House, for instance, would be a White House free of liquor and alcoholic beverages. He was very much about sort of social norms being maintained and proper decorum, but he wasn't a sort of political heavy in some respects. Tilden had been governor of New York, and in fact, it looked in 1876 as if Samuel J. Tilden would be the next president of the United States. And that perhaps suggests, one, the fracturing that had occurred in the Republican Party, its inability to seem to win this election outright just a decade after the end of a civil war. Also, I think it may speak to the return of the conservatives, the return of these Democrats who were so connected both with the peace movement during the war in the North and also with secession in the South. Ultimately, the election is disputed. The results are disputed. And it was dadgum close. Tilden just was on the edge, on the cusp in terms of electoral votes. These are the votes of the Electoral College, which really in the U.S. system determine who will be president. There were disputed votes in South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and even a technicality that had occurred in Oregon. Washington State, had sent 2 sets of electoral returns when the votes were counted. In essence, it's a mess. And under the circumstances, because there was no constitutional structure for dealing with a political mess, an election mess of this sort, the question was thrown to Congress. A 15-member commission was established, pretty much balanced with one more Republican than there were Democrats on the commission. And the threat, I think, was somewhat real that 10 years after the Civil War, you could have a sort of political civil war erupt again. Because what was at stake, really, was the question of whether Reconstruction and specifically the maintenance of United States troops in these former Confederate states, whether that was going to continue. Whether Rutherford B. Hayes had anything to do with it, or whether specifically, a hard, hammered out deal was made. And Hayes, I think, denied this. He denied that he had cut a deal to win the presidency. Nonetheless, the commission decides for Rutherford B. Hayes. And under Hayes' administration, the last federal or United States troops will be removed from the South. And that's happened by 1877. For many Republicans, it's clear that the Republican Party will be sorely challenged to maintain a presence in the American South after those troops are gone. But I think more important is what the removal of those troops and the so-called end of Reconstruction means for African Americans, for freedmen. The protections that had been offered, as minimal as they may have been, were lost. The Republican Party, to which many freedmen had committed themselves politically, understood by 1877 that any future they might have in the South was no longer to be a future that depended or could depend on the African American vote. What I mean by that is, or to use a term perhaps, the Republican Party in the South would be struggling to survive, and race was not a factor that would help in its survival. So Southern Republicans, with the approval of Northern Republicans, made the cynical choice to shift the Republican Party to a very lily white party, a party dominated with predominant whites in positions of power and often voting. That's not to say that African Americans didn't have the chance to vote. Often African Americans did vote. Places like Memphis provide a good example of the way the African American vote could shape events. But in terms of political power, what we see is the removal of those officials, those African American officials who during Reconstruction had served in high office, in Congress, and in state government, as gradually redemption comes to mean the restoration of that old power in the South that had led to secession in the first place. And with it came a reminder, again, about race. That ultimately is, the issue of race lies at the heart of Reconstruction. And it struck me before, and I think it's worth mentioning now, that when it came to race, even during the higher points of Reconstruction, when the radical spirit, so to speak, was at its height, while African Americans, while freedmen were able to vote in the South freely and openly before disfranchisement laws were passed in the late 19th century, and other means were found to get around the 15th Amendment to deny them the vote, that even while during this period of Reconstruction, African Americans could vote in much of the South, blacks remained unable to vote prior to the 15th Amendment, remained unable to vote in much of the North. Even in the North, the issue of race was central. And the idea of race in an expansive sense could include and should include not just race, but race and ethnicity. Something that had long been a part of American political culture and culture generally, of American society. What's to be done, for instance, with the Irish? Where do the Italians fit? Eastern and Southern European immigrants, where do they fit? What about Asians? What about Latino and Hispanic folks who, some of whom had lived in the United States for generations, their families had? What about Native Americans? It's an ongoing debate in American history. And I guess the sort of sad thing about Reconstruction, and what was sad for so many supporters of Reconstruction policies, was that in the 10-year interim between the end of the Civil War and what we might call the end of Reconstruction, the issue at the core, the key problem, had been so tough a nut to crack, so difficult to resolve, that it hadn't been resolved. Race continued to function in the United States in ways that meant tremendous pain for a lot of people. And so when you think about Reconstruction, I think one of the best ways we historians have managed to do it is in terms of sort of that unfinished campaign, that unfinished experiment, or as one historian has put it, the unfinished journey, and something that we ought probably to reflect on as it pertains even now in the United States to questions that we face.